Hello and welcome to Unit 17 of our Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. This section is on the renal system, also known as the excretory system or the urinary system. And the material for this can be found mostly in Chapter 25. All right, so what I'm going to talk about in this lecture is, first of all, what is the purpose of the renal system? Well, as you know, there are a lot of cellular processes that occur inside cells that generate ammonia. Ammonia is a toxic waste product. For example, when you break down amino acids, you often generate ammonia. That's certainly true in cells when they break down amino acids, but it's mainly true of the food in the intestine. You break down a lot of you break down a lot of proteins into amino acids in the stomach and then some more in the intestine, and you end up generating a lot of ammonia. And ammonia is a toxic waste product that would do a lot of damage to the cells and to the other parts of the body were it not for the fact that we convert it into a less toxic form called urea, using something called the urea cycle, which takes place in the mitochondria of the liver cells, the mitochondria of the hepatocytes. And then, so once we've converted the ammonia into urea, it's not as dangerous anymore, but we store it for a brief period of time in the, it still floats around the blood until we can get rid of it. So what we then do is we filter the urea out of the blood inside the kidneys. And then the urea ends up in the urinary bladder, and then it's sent out of the body in the form of urine. A lot of animals like fish don't really have to worry about this because fish are swimming through the ocean and they simply release the ammonia out of their blood directly into the water as they're swimming through it. So with fish, the ammonia comes out of their gills, which is the main area of interchange between oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide and ammonia going out. But there are other animals, like land animals, like humans and other mammals, that we live one place and we sleep one place, and then we don't want to urinate where we sleep. We don't want to excrete our waste products in the same place where we live and sleep. So we have to have the ability to retain them for a little while, and so that's what the urinary bladder is for. You wake up and you leave your little hovel or they're under the root of the tree where you live if you're an animal, and then you wander somewhere else, and then you urinate and you defecate, and then you go back home again, and you leave these toxic waste products someplace else. So it stands to reason that if you're going to retain the urea for a little while, because you don't want to urinate where you sleep, you need a urinary bladder, and if you're going to retain it in your body for a little while, it makes sense to convert it to a form that's not quite as toxic. So mammals convert it into urea. Insects and birds convert it into something called uric acid, which is even less toxic, and we'll talk about that. All right, the second thing we're going to talk about briefly is the human water budget. So the human water budget refers to the fact that we drink a certain amount of water every day and we urinate a certain amount of water every day. And we also generate and lose water in other ways. We lose most of the water that's in our water budget by urinating, but we also lose water when we perspire. And we also lose water every time we exhale because a lot of water comes out in your breath. So a lot of vapor comes out in your breath. So there are many ways that we can lose water. There are certain ways that we can gain water. The main way that humans and other mammals gain water is by drinking water. But you may be surprised to know that aerobic respiration, which is the process of generating energy that takes place in your mitochondria, aerobic respiration generates a certain amount of water as well. So if you add together all the water that you lose during the day and all the amount of water that you gain during the day, just like any other budget, you have to balance the two. If you're taking in more water than you're getting rid of, you will swell up and possibly explode. If you're losing more water than you're taking in, eventually you'll dehydrate and die. So we have a water budget that has to be balanced. Okay, and then we will talk about the effects of water retention on blood pressure. Obviously, we mentioned the fact before that blood pressure is related to many things. Blood pressure is related to the pulse. So faster pulse usually results in higher blood pressure, slower pulse in lower blood pressure. But also, one of the main determinants of blood pressure is the volume of blood that your heart is having to pump around. So if you imagine that you have a hose that's closed on itself so that it forms a circular circuit, you can imagine that if you imagine there's a pump that's pumping water around inside that hose, if you suddenly double the amount of water inside that hose, the hose will get more taut. It will increase the water pressure inside the hose. The same thing is true of human blood pressure. The more volume there is, if you have a slight increase in the volume of blood, the blood pressure will generally go up. You can make it go back down by reducing the volume of blood. And where do we gain or decrease or increase the volume of blood? Well, one of the main places that you can add to or subtract from the volume of blood is in the kidneys. The kidneys will send out urine, and there's certain things that we can do to make sure that our kidneys retain more of the water and therefore causing the volume of blood to go up versus losing or excreting more water, causing the volume of the blood to go down. All right, once we've discussed all these things, we're going to discuss the gross anatomy of the kidneys, the fact that the outer part of the kidney is referred to as a capsule, and it's made of connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue. The outer layer of cells just inside the capsule is called the renal cortex. The renal pelvis is the central part of the kidney where urine is stored before it's sent down a tube called a ureter, and it goes from the ureter to the urinary bladder. The renal pyramids are these kind of filters that are large collections of filters that are used by the kidney to filter the blood. And eventually the renal pelvis collects all this urine that's been filtered out of the blood. It sends it down a tube called a ureter. We have two of them, one for each kidney. And then the urine is temporarily stored in the urinary bladder, and then it is sent out of the body through a tube called the urethra. The tube that the urine leaves the body from is called the urethra, and it's called that in both men and women. All right, and then once we look at the gross anatomy of the kidneys, we'll move on to the microscopic anatomy of the kidneys. These renal pyramids that I talked about earlier, these are made up of millions of little tiny microscopic filters that are called nephridia, and individually, nephridia is a plural word. Individually, one of them is called a nephron. And a nephron is composed of several parts. The first part is something called Bowman's capsule. There's a little bulge that the blood enters into. And then inside the Bowman's capsule, there's a little tiny capillary, which is referred to as a glomerulus. And that capillary, if the blood goes through the glomerulus at a reasonably high pressure, it will squeeze the fluid out of the blood. So what happens inside the glomerulus is that the blood serum, a large fraction or a large portion of the blood serum is pushed out of the little glomerulus, which is a capillary, into Bowman's capsule. So we keep the blood cells, but we force a whole bunch of the liquid out of the blood in the glomerulus. And then this serum that contains the urea that we're trying to get rid of, this blood serum that contains the urea then flows through a bunch of tubes, including a large tube called a collecting duct. And the collecting duct has the job of taking the water and the amino acids and the carbohydrates back. So we push all of or a lot of the serum out of the blood in the glomerulus, and then we take most of the water back in the collecting duct. So we filter the blood by whenever you push a liquid through a filter, the fluid that comes through the filter is referred to as the filtrate. So we filter the blood, we push the serum out into Bowman's capsule through the glomerulus, and therefore we have a filtrate which contains water and a bunch of urea, and then we send it through a bunch of tubes, including a tube called the collecting duct, whose job it is to take the water back but let the urea keep going. And then we'll find out that you can actually vary the amount of water that the collecting duct takes back through hormonal control of urination. So there are certain hormones, including one called antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. And antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, has the ability to increase the efficiency by which the collecting duct takes the water back out of the serum, out of the filtrate. So we'll talk about how urination, how antidiuretic hormone and some other hormones can control the amount of water that is taken back out of the filtrate. All right, so what is the purpose of the renal system once again? The purpose of the renal system is to remove nitrogenous waste from the blood. Breakdown of amino acids and nucleic acids leads to the formation of ammonia. Ammonia is quite toxic, so we have to get rid of it. It has to be excreted. Okay, so we don't want to excrete in the area where we sleep, so we have to be able to retain this ammonia for short periods of time until we can go and get rid of it, preferably someplace else. And so if we're going to retain it for a little while, we generally convert the ammonia into a less toxic compound called urea. And this is accomplished through a series of chemical reactions that take place mostly in the mitochondria of the liver. And this series of chemical reactions is referred to as the urea cycle. Now, as I mentioned before, fish don't really have to worry about this. They simply excrete the ammonia directly into the water that they're swimming through. They don't bother to convert it into urea or uric acid. Mammals convert the ammonia into a slightly less toxic chemical called urea, and then they store it in their bladder until they can get rid of it. And then insects, birds, and reptiles convert it into a very non-toxic chemical called uric acid. Uric acid, as you can see by these purple N's that are in the chemical formula, uric acid contains a lot of nitrogen. And uric acid is, which you would find in bird droppings, for instance, used to be a very good source of fertilizer. In fact, it still is. So you can use, today we found ways to manufacture artificial fertilizers to fertilize soil, but in the old days they used to use bird droppings as fertilizer. It used to be one of the most valuable commodities in the world. And believe it or not, countries in the 19th and 18th centuries actually used to fight wars over who would get possession of islands that were rich in uric acid, because a lot of seagulls and things would be nesting on these islands, and so the islands would be covered in bird droppings, and countries would actually fight wars over who has possession of these islands that are filled with bird droppings, which was called guano, the way countries fight over the possession of oil today. All right, so this is the urea cycle. So this takes place in the liver. So in the liver, we take we take the ammonia and we go through all of these reactions. And I do not expect you to memorize all these reactions, but it's referred to as the urea cycle, which takes place in the mitochondria of the liver, the hepatocytes, and it ultimately converts ammonia into urea. Then urea is filtered out of the body by the kidneys, and it's sent out of the body in the form of urine. We retain it briefly in the urinary bladder, which is a bag that's located in the pelvic area. And the kidneys are the organs that are able to filter the urea out of the blood. All right, so as I said, conversion of ammonia to urea takes place in the hepatocytes, which are liver cells, of course. And then the urea is filtered out of the blood serum by the kidneys, and then the urine is sent to the urinary bladder through a pair of tubes called ureters. And then from the urinary bladder, the urine is sent out of the body in a single tube called the urethra. In men, of course, the urethra exits through the penis, and so urine comes out of the penis. In women, the urine comes out of the end of the urethra is a little lumpy piece of flesh that's located just above the vagina, and it's called the urinary meatus. Okay, so filtration Filtration occurs inside the kidneys, inside little tiny filters, and the microscopic filters contain a little tiny bulb called Bowman's capsule, which contains a little tiny capillary called the glomerulus, which acts as the filter. And remember, whenever you filter a liquid through a filter, the liquid that comes through the filter is renamed as the filtrate. Right? And so what we do is we filter the serum inside the kidneys, inside the glomerulus in particular. So we push everything through the filter, and then we have all of this serum inside Bowman's capsule, and then the collecting duct simply takes back the water. So we push everything out of the blood, and then we take back what we want to keep from the filtrate. All right, how much water do we need to keep in order to keep our daily water budget balanced? All right, so generally, the average human being drinks about 1,500 milliliters or 1.5 liters of water a day. When they talk about having to drink 8 glasses a day of water to be healthy, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to the fact that you need to drink about 1.5 to 2 liters of water a day to be in optimum health. Sometimes you don't remember to drink that much, or if you spend a lot of your day drinking things besides water, it's hard to keep track of what you're drinking, but you should get around 1.5 liters of water a day. We generally eat moist foods, fruits and vegetables and other things, and they generally contribute about 750 milliliters of water per day. And then the aerobic respiration cycle, we remember that glucose is broken down into glucose is broken down and the glucose is broken down in the mitochondria, and the energy that's generated by breaking glucose, the bonds that hold glucose together, is used to generate ATP. Remember that the breakdown of glucose takes place in 3 discrete stages. One is called glycolysis, the second is called the Krebs cycle, and the third is called the electron transport chain. Remember from our discussion on the respiratory system that the electron transport chain consumes oxygen and converts it into water at the end and generates a lot of ATP in the process. So one of the waste products from aerobic respiration is actually water. So just from breathing, we gain about 250 mils of water every day. So that is significant. So as I said, the reason why they recommend that you drink 8 glasses of water a day is because you need to get your 1.5 liters of water. And about that respiratory stuff. So we said that in the mitochondria, we break down glucose and we use the energy to make ATP. The breakdown of glucose occurs in 3 stages: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain consumes oxygen and converts it into water as a waste product. So here's our favorite diagram again, just demonstrating that within the electron transport chain consumes consumes oxygen and converts it to water. So a small fraction of our daily water budget is actually coming from just breathing the air. Okay, what about the sending water out? Okay, so typically we drink about 1.5 liters of water per day, and we also urinate about 1.5 liters of water a day, around 300 milliliters. Between 300 and 500 milliliters every time you urinate would be about right. So, you would expect to urinate maybe 5 or 6 times a day. As you get older, that gets harder to do, and you find yourself urinating more often because the kidneys are not operating as efficiently. We also lose excrement. So in the feces, we lose about 100 milliliters of water. And quite a lot of water is lost through breathing and perspiring. So humans sweat a lot more than we think we do, but the water evaporates into the air so quickly that we don't really notice that we're losing water through the skin. But yes, we lose nearly a liter of water every day just by either perspiring, sweating, or by exhaling water vapor that comes out of our lungs. Remember that the inside of the lungs are very moist. They have to be for the gas exchange to take place, and so that's why there's so much water vapor in our breath when we breathe out. Now, if you're ever trapped in the desert, many of you may know that one of the ways you have to conserve water if you're in the desert because you're perspiring so much. And so one of the ways that you can do that is to close your mouth and breathe through your nose. Uh, so that what happens when you breathe through your nose is that a lot of that water vapor that would normally be exhaled from your mouth will recondense inside the nasal passages, inside the sinuses, and then just be kept. So exhaling, at least exhaling through your nose, is a good way to retain water if you're in an arid environment, if you're in a very dry place. All right, so here's just a graphical representation of the daily water budget. This is how much we drink, 1,500 mils, generate 250 mils from breathing, eat food that has moisture in it, 750 mils, and then when it's coming back out again, 1.5 liters is released through urine, 100 through feces, and then nearly a liter, 900 mils or so, is released through evaporation, a combination of sweating and exhaling water vapor. Now this is a little interesting comparison. There is a little tiny rodent that lives in the desert, which is referred to as the kangaroo rat. And just to point out that humans generate 250 mils of their daily water budget through breathing, which isn't a big amount. It's about 10% of our water budget we generate through breathing. The kangaroo rat never sees drinkable water. The kangaroo rat gets a little bit of moisture through the seeds that it eats, and maybe it eats chomps on it chews on a cactus a little bit, but it gets most of its water in its water budget just from breathing. Right, so it gets most of its water budget just from breathing. Never actually sees water that it can drink. So that's kind of an interesting thing. All right, let's look at the gross anatomy of the human renal system. Okay, so as we said, the liver takes ammonia out of the blood and converts it into urea. Happens in the mitochondria of the hepatocytes through the urea cycle. And then the kidneys push the blood plasma through a filter, which is called the glomerulus, and then selectively takes back the water from the filtrate and allows most of the urea to go back out. It does take a little bit of it back, and we'll see why, but it also takes a bit of the salt back. So the kidneys will take back most of the water, most of the salt, and a little bit of the urea in the collecting duct. Okay, so remember that we have a renal artery that takes blood to each kidney, and we have a renal vein that returns blood from the kidney. The renal artery that's traveling to the kidney contains blood that has a lot of urea in it. The renal vein on the way back, it takes the blood back to the inferior vena cava, and it's now missing most of the urea that it had because it's been filtered out. Remember that on the top of each kidney we have an adrenal gland, which is not part of the renal function. That's part of the endocrine system, which we'll talk about later. So we have two kidneys, of course, that filter the blood. The microscopic filter is referred to as the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a part of the larger structure called the nephron, but a nephron is still microscopic. And the filtrate collects in the renal pelvis, and then it goes out through a couple of tubes called ureters to the urinary bladder, and then outside the body through the urethra. Okay, so here we have a kidney with a renal artery going in and a renal vein coming out. The filtrate is filtered, the urea is filtered out of the kidney. It travels down this tube called it travels down this tube called a ureter to the urinary bladder, and then it travels out of the urinary bladder through the urethra. All right, let's take a look inside the kidney. So outside the kidney, we have a capsule. On the surface, we have a capsule. That's kind of the face of the kidney. Then we have the renal cortex just underneath. Right. So the renal cortex is the outer layer of the outer functional layer of the kidney, called the parenchymal tissue. The outer surface of most organs is referred to as the cortex, and then of course the inner surface of most organs is referred to as the medulla. So the inner part of the kidney, this part here, is the renal medulla. And notice that the renal medulla is divided up into a bunch of things called renal pyramids. And then running up and down from the cortex to the medulla, to the cortex to the medulla, we have millions of these little filters that are called the nephridia, individual nephron. And then here in the center of the kidney, we have the renal pelvis. If you look at a kidney, it looks kind of yellowish. It has kind of a yellow stain in the middle where the renal pelvis is, because that's where the urine is stored very temporarily before it has a chance to go down this tube, which is the ureter, to the urinary bladder. All right, so as we said, the very surface of the kidney is referred to as the renal fascia. And of course, fascia is Latin for face. So the face of the kidney is referred to as the renal fascia, and it's made of connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue. Just underneath the renal fascia is you have a continuation of the layer of connective tissue that's referred to as the renal capsule. Underneath that, we have the renal cortex, which is lighter in color than the renal medulla. Then we have the renal medulla under that, which is divided up into a bunch of renal pyramids. And then at the very center, we have this yellowish stained hollow compartment that's called the renal pelvis, where the urine is stored temporarily until it can flow down a tube called a ureter to the urinary bladder, and then from the urinary bladder to the urethra and out of the body. Okay, let's take a look at the nephron. All right, so the renal arteries divides up into a whole bunch of renal arterioles, and then the individual arterioles will flow into these individual filters, these microscopic filters that are referred to as nephridia, individual nephron. And each nephron, what happens at each nephron is the arteriole will flow into a little bulb that's referred to as Bowman's capsule. Inside this little bulb, we have a little capillary that's called a glomerulus. The blood is filtered out of the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule, and then Bowman's capsule then leads into a tube that kind of travels down from the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus are in the renal cortex. And then the filtrate travels down this tube into the renal medulla and then back up again. And this tube that goes down into the renal cortex and back up again is referred to as the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle. Now, we mentioned earlier on that if you talk about any solution in the body, you could have 100 millimolar salt and 100 millimolar potassium chloride, 200 millimolar sodium chloride. If we don't really care about if we don't really care about the different components that make up a solution, an aqueous solution, we just want to know what the total molarity is of all of the solutes that are dissolved in that solution. We refer to them as osmoles. So we don't measure things in molarity. If we don't care about whether it's how much of it is sodium chloride versus potassium chloride versus glucose versus something else, we just want to add together all of the molarities of all of these dissolved solutes. We refer to them as osmoles. And then, of course, if you divide osmoles by 1,000, you have milliosmoles. So what is the osmotic concentration in the renal cortex? That's the upper part of the kidney. It just so happens that the osmolarity of the renal cortex is 300 milliosmoles, and that, by the way, is the tonicity of the blood as well. So if you look at the concentration of salts and proteins and all kinds of other goodies that are in the blood, you add up the molarity of all those dissolved solutes that are in the blood, it adds up to 300 milliosmoles. And the renal cortex, the tissues of the renal cortex also have an osmolarity of 300 milliosmoles. Okay, now what about down at the bottom of the renal medulla? Down at the bottom of one of those renal pyramids, the osmolarity is actually 1,200 milliosmoles, 1.2 osmoles. Right, so the concentration of salts and other solutes in the kidney is 4 times greater at the bottom of the renal medulla than it is at the top of the renal cortex. And one of the reasons that you have this greater concentration of salts at the bottom of the renal medulla is because it's filled with urea. So I mentioned the fact that we grab some of the urea before it goes out in urine and we take it back. We put that urea into the bottom of the renal medulla. And the reason for that is because as the filtrate that was filtered out of the glomerulus, that filtrate travels from the renal cortex down to the renal medulla. That solution that has a 300 milliosmol concentration is going to be hypotonic relative to the bottom of the medulla, isn't it? So that means that the water will be sucked out of the loop of Henle as it's down at the bottom of the kidney, and that is exactly how we recover the water. Because the bottom of the kidney, bottom of the renal medulla, has a molarity of 1200 milliosmoles. The filtrate, the plasma and whatnot, the filtrate that's traveling through it has an osmolarity of 300 milliosmoles, and so the water will be sucked out of the filtrate that's traveling through the loop of Henle into the renal medulla, and it will be collected up and taken away by a bunch of veins that are that surround the loop of Henle that are referred to as the vasa recta. That network of veins that surrounds the loop of Henle is referred to as the vasa recta. Okay, then we have one more chance at this. The filtrate goes down to the bottom of the medulla, renal medulla. It sucks out a lot of the water. Then it goes back up again to the renal cortex, and then it travels down once again through another tube that's referred to as the collecting duct, which is able to suck even more of the water out using specialized pores that are in the collecting duct referred to as aquaporin channels. Right, so aquaporin channels are basically just cellular channels that are specialized to take in water. Right, so the collecting duct has these little structures called aquaporin channels in it that take out even more of the water and save and collect even more of the water. Right. Now, the interesting thing about the aquaporin channels is that we can regulate how many aquaporin channels the collecting ducts of every nephron have. Right. So when the brain produces antidiuretic hormone, it causes the collecting duct to put more aquaporin channels into it so that it can suck more of the water out of the filtrate and allows you to keep more of the water instead of losing it by urination. Right. That is a function of the collecting duct and the amount of aquaporin channels that we put into the collecting duct. All right, let's look at what this looks like. All right, so this is from your textbook. It just shows that here in the renal pelvis, here in the renal in the renal cortex and the renal medulla, we have millions of these little filter units that are called nephridia, individual nephron. And if you look at each nephron individually, you see that it has a Bowman's capsule, and within that Bowman's capsule is a little glomerulus, right? So an arteriole goes into the glomerulus and pushes all of the serum out of the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule. The fluid then travels through these tubes, and then it travels down into the bottom of the renal medulla through a structure called the loop of Henle. And then it travels back up again to the renal cortex. While it was down in the bottom of the renal medulla, the water was being sucked out because of the higher osmolarity, right? The water was being sucked out due to osmosis, and the water was being collected in a network of veins that is called the vasa recta. And then those veins go back into the renal artery and then back into the inferior vena cava. So we've successfully sucked a whole bunch of the water out of the filtrate and kept it while allowing the urea to just keep on going. And then, so now here we are back in the renal cortex again. Now we have another chance to collect some more of the water. So the second time the water goes down this structure, which is referred to as the collecting duct, and the collecting duct is lined, the cells that form the collecting duct is lined with a bunch of little pores that are referred to as aquaporin channels that can suck even more of the water out. And the number of aquaporin channels that is in the collecting duct is controlled by hormones. If you want more aquaporin channels, then your brain will produce antidiuretic hormone, and then that will cause more aquaporin channels to be put into the collecting duct, and then we'll retain more water. The blood pressure will probably go up in that case. Here's a better diagram. Okay, so here we have The renal artery comes in like this. It branches off into a renal arteriole. The renal arteriole goes into the Bowman's capsule. Inside, you'll see the little glomerulus. The glomerulus pushes the serum out and retains the blood cells, so the blood cells go back into circulation. The serum gets pushed into Bowman's capsule, where it travels down these tubes into the loop of Henle and then back up again. The water is sucked out at the bottom and collected into the vasa recta, these veins called the vasa recta, and then the water comes back up again, the filtrate comes back up again, and then gets sent down the collecting tube, and the collecting tube is lined with aquaporin channels that collect even more of the water. The collecting tubes are all then connected to the renal pelvis, and so what's left after you've sucked more water out, after the collecting duct has sucked even more water out, what's left goes into the renal pelvis, then down through the ureter to the urinary bladder. Okay, this is just a schematic diagram of what happens. So here we have the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. The osmolarity of the filtrate that gets filtered out of the glomerulus is 300 milliosmoles. As it travels down into the bottom of the loop of Henle, we suck out all of this water because of the fact that it's very salty down here. And so through osmosis, the water gets sucked out of the loop of Henle into the tissue and collected by the vasa recta. The water then travels back up again and then goes down the collecting duct, where even more water gets sucked out by the aquaporin channels. All right, now, by the way, as the water is traveling up through the loop of Henle, we also recover some of the salt through active transport, meaning that it takes ATP to power this reaction, because the renal medulla already has salt in it, so it doesn't want to have any more. So we're pumping against the concentration gradient, aren't we? So we are then pumping salt into a tissue that already has a lot of salt, so then we need to use ATP in order to do that. And then we have our second chance to collect some more of the water. So the water goes, the filtrate then goes down the collecting duct, and we collect a whole bunch more salt and a whole bunch more water. And then at the very bottom, we collect some of the urea as well. We put the urea into the bottom of the renal medulla to make it nice and salty, so that it has a 1,200 milliosmol osmolarity. So that allows the water to be sucked out when the filtrate is passing down into it. The amount of aquaporin channels that are put into the collecting duct is controlled by hormones. All right, so here we have a close-up of the collecting duct, and this is one of the cells of the collecting duct. And here we have aquaporin channels that are collecting water from the filtrate as it goes by. And then here we have a bunch of aquaporin channels that are temporarily being stored on a bunch of vesicles that are inside the cell. So they're just sitting inside the cell not doing anything, unless we get a signal from the brain, where the brain sends us down some antidiuretic hormone, which binds to the antidiuretic hormone receptor and then tells the cell to take these aquaporin channels and put them into the wall of the collecting duct so that you can collect more water. All right, so this is how we control how much we're able to excrete versus retain. Right, so remember that retaining more water causes the blood pressure to go up because we've increased the blood volume, and excreting more water tends to cause the blood pressure to go down. Okay, the term diuresis means excessive urination. Antidiuresis means to prevent excessive urination. So there is a hormone that's produced by the pituitary gland of the brain, and we're going to talk in detail about the pituitary gland of the brain. But there is a hormone produced by the pituitary gland of the brain called antidiuretic hormone, abbreviated ADH, also known as vasopressin, and it is produced if the blood is considered to be too salty. Okay, now this is important. When does the pituitary gland start producing antidiuretic hormone? How does it know that you need to retain more water? All right, well, this is an interesting question. Sometimes the brain thinks that you need more water because you've lost a lot of water through evaporation or perspiration or through urination. and it says, "Oh goodness, we don't have enough water in the blood. I better tell the kidneys to retain some more water so that the volume of the blood can go up." Okay, so how does the brain measure how much blood volume that you have? Okay, it's a kind of a funny mechanism. It doesn't quite make sense, but not everything that the body does makes sense. But in fact, what happens is that the brain is able to sense how salty the serum is. And if it's too salty, it assumes that it's too salty because you've lost too much water, either through urination or perspiration. Okay, why on earth would that make sense? Okay, well, if you think about it, just imagine that you have a beaker, right? You have a beaker with 1 liter of water in it. And the concentration, and then you put a salt solution into that water so that you have a 1 molar salt solution, right? You with me so far? So you have a beaker that contains 1 liter of water and 1 mole of salt. Now what happens if you put that beaker onto a hot plate and you evaporate half of the water, right? The water, let's say you evaporate 500 milliliters of the water, what will happen to the salt concentration in the water that remains? Will it be 1 molar? No, it'll be 2 molar. Right? So the brain is kind of thinking along those lines. It's thinking, well, if the osmolarity, if the concentration of salt in your blood serum goes up, it must be because the volume has gone down. And therefore I'm going to send a signal to the kidneys to tell them to retain more water to bring the blood volume back up. And what that hormone will do is it will increase the number of aquaporin channels in the collecting ducts and then collect more water from the filtrate, and then that will actually have the effect of increasing the blood pressure. Okay, so we mentioned the fact that the brain will send this signal based on the saltiness of the blood, assuming that if your blood is very salty, it must be because you've lost some of the water from the blood, but that assumption may not be true. It may actually be your blood may be salty because you've eaten a lot of salty food, and and therefore the brain would guess wrong about the reason for the blood salt concentration being high. So that is why if you eat a lot of salty food, you end up retaining a lot of water. You may swell up a little bit because the brain is assuming, the brain is assuming that you have lost blood volume, and that's the reason why the saltiness of your blood has gone up, and therefore you need to get more water to be retained by the kidneys. And so that's an incorrect assumption, but that's what the brain is doing. All right, so here we have a schematic diagram of this. Right, so the stimulus, we talked about homeostasis. The stimulus is an increase in the blood osmolarity, right? So the saltiness of the blood goes up. A structure in the brain called the hypothalamus, we remember that from the brain section. The hypothalamus contains a type of receptor called an osmoreceptor. Remember that word. I sometimes ask it on exams. An osmoreceptor is a neuron that has the ability to judge how salty the blood serum is. Right? And if the osmoreceptors believe that the blood is too salty, the hypothalamus will send a signal to the pituitary gland, which is located right under the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland will produce antidiuretic hormone, which then puts extra aquaporin channels into the collecting ducts, and that causes you to retain more water. And then the retention of water will cause an increase in the volume of blood, which causes the osmolarity of the blood, the saltiness of the blood, to go back down. Right, so the osmolarity should be around 300 milliosmoles. If it goes slightly higher than that, then you retain more water until it goes back down to 300 milliosmoles. Another thing that antidiuretic hormone does is makes you thirsty. So it causes you to get thirsty, and then you drink more water. Right. There's the hypothalamus giving directions to the pituitary gland in response to higher saltiness of the blood. Right. Put more aquaporin channels into the collecting duct and collect more water, causing the blood volume to increase and therefore the osmolarity to go down. All right. Now, because this process makes you more thirsty, that's one of the reasons why people who own bars are constantly giving you free salty peanuts and free salty peanuts and free pretzels. They're not doing it because they're generous. They're not doing it out of a sense of altruism. They're doing it because they know that if you eat salty food, you'll get thirsty and you'll buy more of their beer. Now, I doubt that all the bartenders know that that's exactly why that's happening. I don't think they know that it has anything to do with the pituitary gland and the antidiuretic hormone, but that's exactly what's happening. You feed people salty food, they will get thirsty and buy more of the beer that you're selling. At the same time, their blood pressure will also go up, and if you have higher blood pressure, it's easier for you to have an embolism. It's easier for blood vessels to be blocked by runaway embolisms. So that's having higher blood pressure is not a good thing. All right, now there's another hormone that there are two or three different hormones that work together or work either together or opposite each other to control the amount of fluid that is retained by the kidney and therefore how high your blood pressure is. So there's another hormonal control system that determines how much control we have, how much water is retained in the kidney, and it is referred to as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It's a very complicated system. We're not going to memorize all of the components of it, but just remember some of them. All right, now there are certain cells that have the ability to sense the blood pressure directly, and these cells are located at a spot inside each nephron right by the afferent arteriole. Remember from the previous lectures that afferent means to go into. So right where the arteriole goes into Bowman's capsule, goes into the glomerulus, there are some little cells that are actually able to physically sense what the blood pressure is. And this takes place at an area where the afferent arteriole touches the distal tubule. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And that area is referred to as the juxtaglomerular apparatus, or the JGA, the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus is a little spot inside each nephron that can physically sense what the blood pressure is. Right? If the blood pressure is perceived by the JGA to be too high, it releases a hormone called renin. And renin, through a whole bunch of indirect steps, it ultimately leads to the production of a hormone called angiotensin and another hormone called aldosterone, which is produced by the adrenal glands. And it causes the kidneys to retain more salt, which therefore causes you to retain more water and causes the blood pressure to go up. Right? So the antidiuretic hormone and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system both cause your blood pressure to go up by causing you to retain more water. Sorry, I think I said that the juxtaglomerular apparatus assumes that, if the blood pressure is too high, it causes you to retain water. It doesn't do that. It does the opposite. All right, so right there is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So that area where the arteriole and the tubule make contact is referred to as the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which can physically sense the blood pressure. And if the blood pressure is too low, it will release renin, which leads to the production of angiotensin and aldosterone, which in turn cause the kidneys to retain more water. So there's the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It produces renin, which leads to the production of angiotensin 1, which leads to the production of angiotensin 2, which causes the adrenal gland on top of the kidney to produce aldosterone, which then causes more salt to be reabsorbed in the distal tubule and also the collecting duct, so that you retain more salt and therefore retain more water. Right? And so what the juxtaglomerular apparatus is cueing on is low blood volume, right, or low blood pressure. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus will produce renin in response to low blood pressure. Okay, here's another hormone that does the opposite. So there's a hormone called the atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, which will tell your kidneys to retain less water because your blood pressure is too high. Okay, so the fact that the atrial natriuretic peptide has the word peptide in the title implies that it is a peptide hormone. A peptide is a small protein. So many of the hormones that we have discussed and that we will discuss are steroid hormones, which are derived from lipids. The ANP is a hormone that is actually a small protein. Right? So one of the reasons why that's important for medical people is that you can take steroid hormones as a pill usually, but if a peptide hormone has to be injected, because a peptide is a small protein. If you put a small protein or any protein into your stomach, it will be broken down into amino acids, and so then it won't actually work anymore. So anyway, there is a peptide hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide that is produced by the atria of the heart. Basically, the atria are able to sense that they're having to pump too much blood around, and they say, wait a minute, you've got too much blood volume. Can you get rid of some of this water so that this job is not so hard for your heart to do? And so the production of ANP by the atria of the heart will tell the kidneys to retain less water, and the blood pressure will go down. Right, so ANP promotes vasodilation, so it causes the blood pressure to go down by widening the blood vessels. And it also causes a reduction in blood volume by causing the kidneys to release water. And so it has the opposite effect of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and it has the opposite effect to the antidiuretic hormone system. Okay, so we have three examples of hormonal control of the intestine of the kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone cues on salt. It uses the saltiness of the blood to cause the collecting duct to retain more water. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system actually measures the blood pressure at the level of the kidney. There's a juxtaglomerular apparatus inside each nephron that measures the blood pressure and then tells you to retain more water if the blood pressure is too low. And the ANP, the atrial natriuretic peptide, is produced by the atria of the heart that are able to sense if there's too much blood volume and tells your kidneys to release some of it. Right, so these are just three of the things that determine how much water is retained by the kidneys, and the amount of water that's retained by the kidneys is critical to determining blood pressure. It's one of several things that determines blood pressure. So because this balance between retaining more water and losing the water is very hard to control, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated system. As you get older, it starts to break down a little bit and then starts to wear out a little bit. And so as you get older, you have trouble maintaining this balance, and you find yourself usually urinating a lot more. And in addition to that, as you get older, because it's difficult to maintain this balance as well as a bunch of other balances, as well as maintaining control over your pulse and over the dilation of the blood vessels, you tend to have hypertension. You tend to have higher blood pressure. Right? So the older you get, the more you tend to urinate and the higher your blood pressure tends to get, because all of this complicated balance between blood volume and blood pressure is starting to break down a little bit. So these two hormones increase the blood pressure by causing you to retain more water. This one causes you to decrease the blood pressure by causing you to release or excrete more water. All right, so we talked about the purpose of the renal system. The main purpose is to convert ammonia wastes into urea and then send it out, filter the urea out of the blood serum and send it out in the form of urine. We talked about the effects of water retention on blood pressure. We've talked about that before. We talked about the gross anatomy of the kidney, the microscopic anatomy of the nephron, and hormonal control over urination using antidiuretic hormone versus the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system versus the ANP system. All right, our next lecture, I believe, will be on the reproductive system.